The morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport's bustling terminal as James Morrison adjusted his military dress uniform one final time. The elderly man, now 73 years old, moved with the careful precision of someone whose body bore the weight of decades of service to his country. His weathered hands smoothed down the front of his jacket, where numerous medals caught the fluorescent lighting overhead. Among them, one decoration stood out with particular prominence: the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor for valor in the face of enemy action. James had been awarded this distinguished medal 45 years earlier during a harrowing mission in Northern Ireland, where he had single-handedly saved the lives of 12 civilians trapped in a burning building while under heavy enemy fire. The memory of that day remained as vivid as ever, though he rarely spoke of it to anyone outside his immediate family. Today he was traveling to Edinburgh to attend a special ceremony honoring veterans of his regiment, many of whom were no longer alive to receive recognition for their sacrifice. The airport was particularly busy this Tuesday morning, with travelers rushing to catch flights and families saying their goodbyes. James made his way through the security checkpoint without incident, his military identification and veteran status ensuring a smooth passage through the various screening procedures. He had chosen to wear his dress uniform for the journey, both out of respect for the ceremony he was attending and because it was tradition among the remaining members of his unit to travel in full military regalia when attending such formal occasions. As he approached the departure gate for his flight to Edinburgh, James noticed the area was crowded with passengers waiting to board. He found an empty seat near the window and settled in, placing his small travel bag carefully beside him. The Victoria Cross on his chest seemed to draw curious glances from other passengers, though most were too polite or too hurried to approach him directly. James was accustomed to this attention and had learned over the years to wear his decorations with quiet dignity rather than seeking recognition or praise from strangers. The gate agent, a young woman in her 20s wearing the airline standard uniform, began preparing for the boarding process. She moved efficiently between her computer terminal and the microphone, occasionally glancing at the growing crowd of passengers. James observed her professional demeanor and remembered his own children when they had been starting their careers, full of energy and determination to prove themselves in their chosen fields. A commotion near the check-in desk caught James's attention. A family with several young children was having difficulty with their seating arrangements, and the situation appeared to be escalating. The parents looked stressed and overwhelmed, while their children grew increasingly restless as the delay continued. James considered offering assistance, as he had often done throughout his life when he encountered people in distress, but decided to wait and see if the airline staff could resolve the matter themselves. The boarding announcement finally came through the terminal speakers, and passengers began forming lines according to their ticket categories. James checked his boarding pass and noted that he would be among the first group called to board, thanks to his veteran status and the airline's policy of showing respect to military personnel. He gathered his belongings and prepared to join the queue, looking forward to the flight and the reunion with his old comrades that awaited him in Scotland. As he stood up from his seat, James felt a slight twinge in his left knee, a reminder of an old injury sustained during his military service. He had learned to manage such discomfort over the years, and it certainly wasn't going to prevent him from attending this important ceremony. The elderly veteran straightened his shoulders and walked toward the boarding area, his medals catching the light with each step he took across the polished airport floor. The boarding process had begun smoothly, with first-class passengers and those requiring special assistance being called forward. James Morrison waited patiently in the priority line, watching as business travelers and families made their way onto the aircraft. The gate agent, who had been working efficiently, suddenly paused and looked directly at him, her expression changing from professional courtesy to something that appeared almost dismissive. Sarah Williams, the gate agent, had been working for the airline for just 8 months. She had joined the company straight from university, eager to begin her career in the aviation industry. However, the job had proven more stressful than she had anticipated, with demanding passengers, flight delays, and constant pressure to maintain schedules. This particular morning had been especially challenging, with 2 earlier flights experiencing technical difficulties and numerous passenger complaints to handle. When James approached the boarding counter with his ticket, Sarah barely glanced at his documentation before focusing on her computer screen. She typed rapidly, seemingly checking and rechecking information that should have been straightforward. Other passengers in the priority line began to shift impatiently behind James, and the atmosphere grew tense as the delay continued without explanation. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," Sarah announced loudly, her voice carrying across the gate area. "There seems to be an issue with your boarding status." Her tone was sharp and authoritative, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who turned to observe the unfolding situation. James, surprised by this unexpected development, remained calm and asked politely what the problem might be. Sarah's response was swift and cutting. "Look, I don't know what kind of costume party you're going to, but those fake medals aren't going to get you any special treatment here." Her words echoed through the gate area, causing a collective gasp from the assembled passengers. Several people pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. The elderly veteran stood in stunned silence for a moment, processing what he had just heard. In all his years of military service and the decades that followed, he had never experienced such a public humiliation. The Victoria Cross on his chest, earned through acts of extraordinary courage and representing the highest honor his country could bestow, had just been dismissed as a costume accessory by someone who clearly had no understanding of its significance. "Miss, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," James replied with remarkable composure, his voice steady despite the shock of the accusation. "These are my service medals, and this is my military dress uniform. I'm traveling to attend a veterans ceremony in Edinburgh." He spoke quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation and avoid further embarrassment for both himself and the young woman who had so gravely misjudged the situation. Sarah, however, seemed determined to assert her authority. "I've seen plenty of people trying to scam their way into priority boarding with fake military credentials," she declared, her voice growing even louder. "Security protocols require me to verify suspicious claims, and frankly, you look too old to be in active service anyway." The comment about his age struck particularly deep, as James had served his country with distinction for over 3 decades before retiring with full honors. The other passengers in the area began to murmur among themselves, with several clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. A few attempted to intervene on James's behalf, but Sarah waved them off, insisting that she was simply following proper procedures. The situation continued to escalate as more travelers gathered to observe the confrontation, many of them recording the incident on their mobile devices. James remained standing at the counter, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation he was enduring. He had faced enemy fire, survived life-threatening situations, and led men through some of the most dangerous conflicts of his generation. Yet this moment in a busy airport terminal was testing his composure in ways that battlefield stress had never managed to do. The confrontation at the boarding gate was drawing an increasingly large crowd of onlookers. Passengers from nearby gates had begun to drift over, curious about the commotion that was delaying the Edinburgh flight. Sarah Williams seemed oblivious to the growing attention her actions were attracting, remaining focused on what she perceived as her duty to prevent fraudulent boarding attempts. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove those fake decorations and return to the general boarding queue," Sarah announced, pointing directly at James's Victoria Cross. This kind of stolen valor is not only offensive to real military personnel, but it's also illegal in many jurisdictions. Her accusation sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the assembled passengers, many of whom were beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. An elderly woman standing nearby stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Young lady, do you have any idea what you're saying?" she demanded. "That gentleman is clearly a decorated war hero, and you're treating him like a common criminal." Her intervention was supported by several other passengers who voiced their agreement, but Sarah remained unmoved by the criticism. James Morrison continued to maintain his composure, though the color had drained from his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, extracting several official documents that he handed to Sarah. "These are my military service records and veteran identification cards," he said quietly. "Perhaps they will help clarify any confusion about my status." Sarah glanced briefly at the documents before pushing them back across the counter. "Anyone can fake paperwork these days," she declared dismissively. "I've seen plenty of convincing forgeries in my time here. What I need is official verification from military authorities, which obviously isn't available at this hour of the Morning. Her refusal to accept the authentic documentation only served to further anger the growing crowd of witnesses. A middle-aged man in a business suit approached the counter, his expression stern. Miss, I'm a retired Army officer myself, and I can assure you that those medals are genuine, he stated firmly. The Victoria Cross has very specific design elements that are extremely difficult to replicate, and everything I see on this gentleman's uniform is authentic. His professional opinion carried weight with the surrounding passengers, but Sarah seemed determined to stick to her position. The situation took another turn when a young soldier in civilian clothes stepped forward from the crowd. Ma'am, I'm currently serving with the Royal Guards, and I recognize this gentleman from photographs in our regimental history, he said respectfully to Sarah. Mr. Morrison is a legend among military personnel, and his service record is well documented. You're making a serious error in judgment here. Despite this testimony from an active duty soldier, Sarah remained defiant. I don't care who you people claim to be, she snapped. I have procedures to follow and I'm not going to compromise. Airport security because a bunch of passengers think they know better than trained airline staff. Her stubbornness was becoming increasingly problematic as more people gathered to witness the unfolding drama. The boarding process for the Edinburgh flight had come to a complete standstill. Other gate agents were beginning to notice the disruption, and several approached to ask if assistance was needed. However, Sarah waved them away, insisting that she had the situation under control and that no supervisory intervention was necessary. James stood silently throughout this extended ordeal, his hands clasped behind his back in a military stance that spoke to decades of discipline and service. The public humiliation was clearly taking its toll, but his training and character prevented him from responding with anything other than dignified restraint. The Victoria Cross on his chest caught the terminal lighting, its bronze surface seeming to glow with the weight of the heroic actions it represented. The scene at Gate 15 had transformed from a routine boarding process into something resembling a public tribunal. Passengers continued to arrive, drawn by the growing commotion and the increasingly heated exchanges between Sarah Williams and the crowd of supporters who had rallied around James Morrison. The elderly veteran remained at the center of the controversy, his military bearing unchanged despite the extraordinary circumstances he was facing. A woman with a press badge hanging from her neck pushed through the crowd, recognizing the potential significance of what was unfolding. Emma Thompson, a journalist for a national newspaper, had been traveling to Edinburgh to cover a political conference when she noticed the disturbance. Her experienced eye immediately recognized the genuine nature of James's decorations, and she began taking notes while discreetly recording the incident on her phone. Excuse me, sir, Emma addressed James directly. Would you be willing to share your name and service history with me? I think the public has a right to know what's happening here. James hesitated for a moment, uncomfortable with the idea of drawing even more attention to himself, but ultimately provided his basic information, including his regiment and the year he received the Victoria Cross. Emma quickly searched military databases on her phone, and within minutes she had confirmed James's identity and service record. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the surrounding crowd, this is James Morrison, Victoria Cross recipient, who saved 12 civilian lives during a terrorist attack in Belfast in 1979. He served with distinction for 32 years and retired with the rank of colonel. Her announcement sent a wave of shock and outrage through the assembled passengers. Sarah Williams, however, remained unmoved by this revelation. I don't care what some random journalist claims to have found on the internet, she stated defiantly. My job is to verify credentials according to airline procedures, and I haven't seen anything that meets our official requirements. Her continued obstinacy was beginning to attract the attention of airport security personnel, who were monitoring the situation from a distance. The crowd around the gate had grown to over 50 people, with passengers from multiple flights now involved in the drama. Several were live streaming the incident on social media, and the story was beginning to spread across various platforms. Comments and shares were accumulating rapidly, with viewers expressing outrage at the treatment of the decorated veteran. An airline supervisor finally arrived at the gate, having been alerted to the disturbance by other staff members. Margaret Foster had been working for the airline for over 15 years and immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. She approached Sarah and James, attempting to understand what had led to such an extraordinary confrontation. "Sarah, what exactly is the problem here?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice low and professional. Sarah quickly explained her position, emphasizing her concerns about fraudulent military credentials and her responsibility to maintain security protocols. Margaret listened carefully, then examined James's documentation and uniform with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with military passengers for many years. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, turning to address the veteran directly, "I want to personally apologize for this misunderstanding. Your credentials are clearly authentic and you should never have been subjected to this treatment." She then turned back to Sarah with a stern expression. "This gentleman is a national hero, and the way you've handled this situation is completely unacceptable." Sarah's face flushed red as she realized the magnitude of her error. The crowd of passengers erupted in applause at Margaret's words, with many calling out supportive comments to James. However, the damage had already been done, and the incident had been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded for posterity. Margaret immediately began making arrangements to rectify the situation, offering James an upgrade to first class and promising a full investigation into the matter. But as she worked to resolve the immediate crisis, none of them were aware that an even more significant development was about to unfold. Unknown to everyone present, the delay caused by this confrontation was about to intersect with another event that would transform the entire situation into something far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. As Margaret Foster worked frantically to resolve the situation at Gate 15, a different kind of activity was beginning to unfold elsewhere in Heathrow Airport. Security personnel in crisp uniforms were taking up positions throughout the terminal, their earpieces crackling with coded communications. Maintenance crews appeared with unusual efficiency, quickly checking and rechecking various systems while keeping their conversations to hushed tones. The passengers gathered around James Morrison remained focused on the drama that had just reached its resolution, with many still expressing their outrage at the treatment the decorated veteran had received. Social media posts about the incident were multiplying rapidly, with hashtags related to veteran rights and military respect beginning to trend across multiple platforms. The story was gaining momentum far beyond the confines of the airport terminal. In a private section of the airport typically reserved for VIP arrivals and departures, a convoy of black vehicles was making its way across the tarmac. The lead car bore the distinctive royal standard, indicating the presence of a member of the British royal family. Inside, King Charles III was reviewing his schedule for the day, which included an unexpected stop at Edinburgh, before continuing to his planned engagements in Scotland. The King's security detail had been in communication with airport authorities for the past hour, coordinating the logistics of his unscheduled arrival. Originally, His Majesty had planned to travel directly to Scotland by helicopter, but weather conditions had forced a change to commercial aviation facilities. The Royal Protection Officers were working to ensure that his passage through the airport would be both secure and discreet. Back at Gate 15, James Morrison was finally being escorted to the aircraft by Margaret Foster personally. The supervisor had arranged for him to board ahead of all other passengers, and she continued to apologize profusely for the treatment he had received. The crowd of supporters applauded as he walked toward the jetway, many calling out words of respect and gratitude for his service. Sarah Williams stood behind the gate counter, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly, as the full implications of her actions began to sink in. Several passengers had approached her directly to express their disapproval, and she was becoming increasingly aware that her behavior had been recorded and was likely being shared across social media platforms. The confident authority she had displayed earlier was rapidly crumbling into anxiety and regret. The royal convoy reached the main terminal building, where a small team of airport executives was waiting to receive their distinguished visitor. King Charles emerged from his vehicle with characteristic dignity, acknowledging the greetings of the airport staff, while his security team maintained their protective formation around him. The King's schedule called for a brief transit through the public areas of the airport before proceeding to his flight. As the royal party entered the terminal, they were guided toward the departure gates area. The King's route had been carefully planned to minimize disruption to regular airport operations, but his presence was already being noticed by observant passengers and staff members. Word began to spread quietly through the terminal that a member of the royal family was in the building. The timing of these two separate events was about to create an extraordinary convergence. The Edinburgh flight that James Morrison was boarding was experiencing a slight delay due to the earlier disruption, which meant that passengers were still in the gate area when the royal party began making its way through the terminal. The path that had been selected for King Charles's transit would take him directly past Gate 15, where the aftermath of the confrontation was still very much evident. Margaret Foster was just returning from ensuring James's comfortable seating on the aircraft when she received an urgent call on her radio. Airport security was informing all gate personnel that a VIP movement was in progress and that they should be prepared for possible schedule adjustments. As she acknowledged the message, she had no idea that the VIP in question was about to encounter the very situation she had just finished resolving: the royal protection. Officers leading the king's escort were the first to notice the unusual crowd gathered around Gate 15. Their trained eyes immediately assessed the situation, noting the agitated passengers, the visible media presence, and the general atmosphere of tension that still lingered in the area. They quickly adjusted their route slightly, but the king had already noticed the commotion and was asking his staff about what appeared to be taking place. King Charles III approached Gate 15 with the measured pace that had characterized his public appearances for decades. His security detail had briefed him about the disturbance in the area, explaining that there had been some kind of confrontation involving a passenger, but they had not yet provided the specific details of what had transpired. The king's natural curiosity about his subjects and their welfare prompted him to inquire further about the situation. As the royal party drew closer to the gate area, several passengers recognized the distinctive figure of the monarch. A hush began to fall over the crowd as people realized they were witnessing an extraordinary moment. Phones were quickly raised to capture images, though the security personnel gestured for discretion and maintained their protective positions. Around the king, Margaret Foster noticed the approaching royal entourage and felt her heart rate increase dramatically. In her 15 years with the airline, she had never encountered such a convergence of significant events. She quickly moved to intercept the group, hoping to provide whatever assistance might be required while simultaneously trying to process the implications of having both a decorated war hero and the king present in her gate area within the span of minutes. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, offering a respectful curtsy as the king paused near the gate counter. "I'm Margaret Foster, the gate supervisor here. We've just had a rather unfortunate incident involving one of our passengers, a military veteran who was treated inappropriately by our staff." Her words were carefully chosen, but the gravity of the situation was evident in her tone. King Charles, who had served in the Royal Navy and maintained strong connections with military communities throughout his life, immediately showed interest in the details. "What kind of incident?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting complete and honest answers to his questions. Before Margaret could respond, Emma Thompson, the journalist who had been documenting the earlier confrontation, approached respectfully. "Your Majesty, if I may," she said, "the passenger in question is Colonel James Morrison, a Victoria Cross recipient who was accused of wearing fake medals and denied proper boarding privileges." The entire incident was quite shocking to witness. The king's expression darkened noticeably at this information. As someone who understood better than most the significance of military decorations and the sacrifices they represented, he was clearly troubled by what he was hearing. "Where is Colonel Morrison now?" he inquired, looking around the gate area. "He's been seated on the aircraft, Your Majesty," Margaret replied quickly. "We've upgraded him to first class and offered our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding." She gestured toward the jetway, where the Edinburgh flight was still preparing for departure. King Charles turned to his security detail and spoke briefly in hushed tones. After a moment of discussion, he made a decision that surprised everyone present. "I would like to speak with Colonel Morrison personally," he announced. "This kind of treatment of our military veterans is absolutely unacceptable, and I want to ensure he knows that his service is properly recognized and valued." The announcement sent a wave of excitement through the assembled passengers, many of whom began to understand that they were witnessing a moment of genuine historical significance. The security personnel immediately began coordinating with airport authorities, to arrange for the King's access to the aircraft, while Margaret Foster worked to notify the flight crew of the extraordinary circumstances developing at their gate. Sarah Williams, who had been standing silent and increasingly pale throughout this exchange, suddenly found herself the focus of the King's attention. "Are you the staff member who questioned this gentleman's credentials?" he asked directly, his tone carrying unmistakable displeasure. "Yes, Your Majesty," Sarah replied in a barely audible whisper, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I was following security procedures, but I realize now that I made a terrible mistake." Her hands were visibly shaking as she faced the full weight of royal disapproval for her actions. The King studied her for a moment before responding. "Young lady, the Victoria Cross is the highest honor for valor that can be bestowed upon a member of our armed forces. To question its authenticity without just cause is not merely a procedural error. It's a grave insult to every person who has served our nation with distinction." His words carried the weight of someone who understood military tradition and sacrifice at the deepest level. The crowd of passengers had grown even larger, as word spread throughout the terminal that the King was present and addressing the incident. Many were recording the unprecedented scene, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. The convergence of events had created something far beyond what anyone could have anticipated when James Morrison had first approached the boarding counter that morning. The jetway leading to the Edinburgh flight became the setting for an extraordinary meeting between two men who represented different aspects of British service and dedication. King Charles III, accompanied by his security detail and senior airport officials, made his way onto the aircraft where Colonel James Morrison was seated in the upgraded first-class cabin. The elderly veteran rose immediately upon recognizing his sovereign, his military training evident in his crisp salute and respectful bearing. "Please, Colonel Morrison, remain seated," the King said warmly, extending his hand in greeting. "I've just learned about the appalling treatment you received this morning, and I wanted to personally apologize for what happened and to thank you for your extraordinary service to our nation." The sincerity in the King's voice was unmistakable, and the other passengers on the aircraft watched in amazement as this unprecedented scene unfolded before them. James Morrison, despite his composure throughout the earlier ordeal, found himself momentarily overcome with emotion. "Your Majesty, this is an unexpected honor," he replied, his voice steady but clearly moved by the gesture. "I never imagined that my small difficulties this morning would reach your attention, and I'm deeply grateful for your kindness in coming to speak with me personally." The King examined James's Victoria Cross with the knowledge of someone who understood its profound significance. "Colonel, there is nothing small about the disrespect shown to a holder of the Victoria Cross," he stated firmly. "Your actions in Belfast in 1979 saved innocent lives at tremendous risk to yourself, and that sacrifice deserves recognition and respect, not suspicion and humiliation." The King's words resonated throughout the aircraft cabin, where fellow passengers listened intently to this remarkable exchange. Word of the King's presence on the aircraft had spread rapidly throughout Heathrow Airport, creating a media sensation that extended far beyond the original incident at Gate 15. News outlets were scrambling to cover the story, while social media exploded with posts, images, and videos from passengers who had witnessed various aspects of the extraordinary morning's events. Back in the terminal, Sarah Williams faced the consequences of her actions as airline executives arrived to conduct an immediate investigation. The incident had already generated significant negative publicity for the company, and the involvement of the royal family had elevated the situation to a level that demanded serious corporate response. Margaret Foster was tasked with providing a detailed account of everything that had transpired, while Sarah was relieved of her duties pending a full review. The King spent several minutes in conversation with James Morrison, discussing not only the morning's events but also the veteran's service history and the upcoming ceremony in Edinburgh. His Majesty's genuine interest in military affairs and veterans' welfare was evident in his thoughtful questions and attentive listening. The other first-class passengers, while trying to respect their privacy, could not help but be moved by witnessing such a personal moment of royal recognition. As their conversation concluded, the King made an announcement that surprised everyone present. "Colonel Morrison, I would be honored if you would join me in my aircraft for the journey to Edinburgh," he offered. "We're both traveling to Scotland today, and I believe it would be far more appropriate for a Victoria Cross recipient to travel in circumstances befitting his status and service. The offer was as unexpected as it was generous, and James initially attempted to decline, feeling that such recognition was unnecessary. However, the king insisted, explaining that it would be his privilege to ensure that a decorated war hero received the respect and treatment he deserved after the morning's unfortunate events. The transfer from the commercial flight to the royal aircraft created another wave of excitement. Throughout the airport, passengers and staff alike gathered to witness the remarkable conclusion to a story that had begun with disrespect and humiliation, but had transformed into a powerful demonstration of how true leadership responds to injustice. Within hours, the story had become international news, with media outlets around the world reporting on the incident and the king's response. The contrast between Sarah Williams's initial treatment of the veteran and the royal recognition that followed became a powerful symbol of the importance of respecting military service and understanding the significance of military honors. For James Morrison, what had started as a routine flight to attend a veteran's ceremony had become an unforgettable experience that would be remembered for the rest of his life. The humiliation he had endured at Gate 15 was completely overshadowed by the extraordinary honor of traveling with his sovereign and receiving personal recognition from the highest authority in the
And the incident also sparked broader
conversations about veteran recognition, the importance of military education for civilian personnel, and the responsibility that service organizations have to treat decorated military personnel with appropriate respect. Sarah Williams eventually lost her position with the airline, while new training procedures were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. The story became a lasting reminder that true honor and service will always ultimately receive the recognition they deserve, sometimes in the most unexpected and remarkable ways possible.